Okay, good morning, everyone. Welcome to our FARMAX 8.2 release webinar. For anyone that hasn't come across me before, my name is Tom. I am a business development manager here at FARMAX, and basically I'm going to run you through this morning some of the things we've been working on over the past several months that have recently gone live in FARMAX. I guess some of the reasons behind why we've released some of these new features, and then the bulk of the webinar really will be walking you through some of these updates in FARMAX so that you can see how those features work for yourselves. So just a couple of things first off. So this webinar is being recorded. Everyone is in a listen only mode for the session, but you're more than welcome to put in any questions in the chat function within Zoom here, and I will get to those questions where I can and answer them as best I can. If I can't answer any questions during the session, I'll be sure to follow up with you. So webinar has been recorded, and we will send a replay through to everyone with any follow-ups if required over the next day or so. So definitely pop your questions in the chat there. But for now, let's get straight into it. So hopefully this is going to work for me. Perfect. So like I say, a couple of things I just want to cover initially this morning, kind of talk through some of the thoughts kind of going on in our heads around why we've been kind of going in the direction we have been going in terms of adding some of these new features to FARMAX, and then we will give you a bit of a demo. So as many of you will know, but a bit of a refresher for those that maybe haven't used FARMAX a huge amount before, behind the scenes, FARMAX is really a decision support tool, and what it's trying to do when you put your data into FARMAX is it's really trying to understand what the feed supply and demand looks like on a farm. And for a long time, the decisions that we were helping farmers to make were really focused around two kind of core aspects of the farm system. Firstly, profitability and feed budgeting. Those were kind of the two core elements. But more recently, of course, the environmental focus has gotten more and more relevant. So in the past couple of years, we've kind of continued to add new environmental functionality to FARMAX as well. Initially, that came from adding a greenhouse gas component, calculating your greenhouse gas emissions from stock and from fertilizer. And more recently, we have also added carbon sequestration. So if you want to add in any forestry blocks or native areas that you've got on a farm, or if you're wanting to run scenarios around changes in those areas, you can now do that in FARMAX and understand how it impacts all three kind of aspects of the system, how it impacts the feed budget, how it impacts financial performance, and how it impacts your environmental emissions as well. So FARMAX 8.2 is really kind of the next step down that track with adding a few more features in a couple of different areas. We have definitely made some improvements on the feed budgeting side, as we'll get into shortly, but we've also had some additions on the environmental side of things as well. And just again, a bit of a refresher in terms of how FARMAX calculates those greenhouse gas emissions. This is a somewhat complicated diagram, but the kind of core idea that you really need to know here is that there's really two elements to the greenhouse gas emissions that come out of FARMAX. One is the sort of gross emissions from your stock and from your fertilizer, and then any sequestration on the farm from areas of forestry or natives. So like I say, FARMAX 8.2 is kind of another step down the pathway of helping farmers to make better decisions and really get the balance right around those core areas of the farm system. And this is a list of some of the highlights in terms of new features that we'll walk through today in terms of being able to better describe the farm system and also get better reporting to understand how changes that you make in a farm system impact the performance of the business and of the farm. So with that said, I will just stop sharing this PowerPoint. And I will share FARMAX and we'll dive straight into there. And like I say, if you've got questions throughout this demo, feel free to pop those in the chat as well. Okay. Cool. So hopefully you are seeing FARMAX now. I'm sure someone will let me know in the chat if you can't, but that should be coming through hopefully. Now this is FARMAX Red Meat. A lot of the features that I will show here will have basically exact overlap in FARMAX Dairy. So if you're a FARMAX Dairy user, don't worry that I'm doing this in the Red Meat version. The functionality works in the same way for more or less all of the features that I'm going to show today. So just before I open up a monitoring file for this farm, I wanted to walk through one new feature that we've recently added, or a couple of new features that we've recently added in this initial cloud window. So this is essentially a bit of a directory of where all your farms and FARMAX files are currently stored. Now, one of the things we've added, if you are going to create a new farm, so I'll just click new farm up the top left here. So we've added basically a new input here when you create a new farm, and that input is to do with your farm's location. So let's just call this new farm webinar. I'm going to say that this is in the Bay of Plenty. Let's go for Western Bay of Plenty, and I can now click show map. And that will have a bit of a guess based off the region and district that I just put in around where the farm actually is. And I can zoom in and kind of click around and drop a point on exactly where the farm is to add in my longitude and latitude. That's kind of one way you can do it, is to kind of drag around on the map and drop a pin. The other way you can do it is you can type in an address as well. So now this is no longer going to be in the Bay of Plenty, but if I put in the address of the FARMAX office, I can drop a pin there, hit OK, and that will drop in the longitude and latitude for the farm. So that's data that we're collecting to basically in future we really want to add some more intelligence around localized forecasts, potentially around pasture growth rates. So that's sort of the first step in collecting some of that data. So I will click cancel on that. I won't actually create the farm, but if you are creating a farm, that is where that feature will show up. And if you have an existing farm, you can still put in that data as well. So if I open up the monitoring file here for this particular farm, in the properties screen under location here, I have a little pop out where again, I get that map and I can drop a pin and add in my longitude and latitude for the farm if you've got an existing farm in FARMAX. Now I'll just go back a step and show you one other feature that we've added in this cloud window before we move on. And that is basically to do with version history. So some of you may be familiar with version history in Microsoft programs, for example. So if you save a Microsoft Word document, you can go back and look at previous saves you've made of that document if you want to kind of go back in time a little bit. And we have had the ability to do that with your FARMAX files for a little while. So if you accidentally saved over a scenario, or you save some changes that you didn't really intend to, you have been able to contact us at the help desk and we've been able to restore that data. But we've actually now added some features added a feature to be able to do that yourself in FARMAX. So basically to do that, if I had accidentally saved a change in this monitoring file and I wanted to revert back slightly, I can now right click on monitoring. I have an option here, which is new called version history. And if I go to version history, I will get a few of the dates and times for me just over the past couple of days, because this farm's relatively new for me in FARMAX, but generally those dates would go back a lot further if you'd been working on that file for a while. And I can pick which one that I want to recover. So if I want to recover one from this morning at 9:16, I can click on that one, hit recover, and that will drop it down here as a scenario, which you can go and kind of check that it's the one you're after, and then go file save as and save it over the top of your monitoring file or whichever scenario you want to, if you want to kind of put that one in place of the existing scenario. So that should be a useful feature. Hopefully I'll just delete that file out for now though. Okay, let's keep moving along. So I will fire up this monitoring file again. And let's have a look through one of the more significant changes that has come to FARMAX 8.2, which is really to do with fertilizers and some improvements we've made there with both the financial forecasting and also the feed budgeting element of fertilizers. And actually some small improvements around greenhouse gases as well. So many of you will be quite familiar with the crops and feeds database. This is basically a library of different crops and feeds that we've had in FARMAX for a long time, where you can describe the ME, the typical yield, the typical cost to grow or purchase any given crop or supplement. And it really gives FARMAX users a lot of flexibility so that when they want to run a scenario around putting in a new crop or purchasing in a new feed, they can pull from that library, and we've got some, reasonably intelligent defaults to kind of drop into your FARMAX scenario and update your financials and your feed budget and so on. And in FARMAX 8.2, we've effectively created a very similar kind of library of fertilizers. So, excuse me. So you can now add in custom fertilizers. By default, we've just got a couple here initially just to kind of get you started. But if you do want to add a new fertilizer, you can come up to new fertilizer and select the category. At the moment, we've just got urea and other. The reason those are split out is those have slightly different greenhouse gas treatments. And hopefully coming up soon, we'll be adding a sort of coated urea option in there as well. But at this stage, you can add in urea or other. If I go urea, that gives me urea 2. I can rename the fertilizer to whatever product that I'm putting on, add in the NPKs, and then pop in a price would probably be the other key element as well. So, and then we have also upgraded the sort of response and duration settings for fertilizers as well, which I'll show you in a sec. That should be a little more meaningful when I walk through that shortly. But you can now start kind of adding those to your library, and obviously fertilizer prices are moving around a lot at the moment, mostly upwards. So this should give you more intelligent forecasting around what your kind of true cost of fertilizer is likely to be based on what your fertilizer policies are, essentially. So that is the fertilizer database. I will move through to actually putting on some nitrogen applications, because that'll show you where this kind of kicks in. So if I head down to the flat rolling block and jump into my nitrogen screen, this is where you can put on those nitrogen applications. Now, I've got an existing urea application in here, and previously this was just like a new nitrogen button up the top, and that would pop in a generic nitrogen application. This is now actually a drop-down menu, so that will show each of the different kind of fertilizer options that you've got in that database we just looked at earlier, and you can pick and choose which fertilizer you want to add in, and that'll obviously bring through your costs and your NPKs and so on. So that's the first thing we've added in. If I look at this existing urea application, I'll just walk you through some of the changes there as well. So again, we've added a little more flexibility in terms of how you can basically input the rate of fertilizer that you're applying. So previously, basically the only way to do it was to add in how many kilograms of nitrogen per hectare you were applying. We've now broadened that out a little bit, so you can still put in that amount of nitrogen per hectare, but you can also put in a product weight per hectare. So, and then it will kind of utilize those NPKs stats to figure out the nitrogen component for you. So in some cases, that might be a more straightforward input, is just to put in the total amount of product per hectare, or you can just put in a straight total. So if you know the bulk, tonnage that was applied for that particular application, you can put that in, again, either in product weight or nitrogen weight sort of terms. So that should add a good amount of flexibility. Now, one of the other key changes we've made here, which is quite cool around your nitrogen response, is we've actually incorporated some kind of industry standard rules around what type of response you would typically get from a nitrogen application. So if you've used FARMAX before, you may recall that we used to have some reasonably generic figures in there. I think it was like a 10-to-1 response with 10 kilos of dry matter for every kilogram of nitrogen applied. And it didn't really change through the season or between farms. It was kind of just a standard input, and you could override it if you want, but that's sort of where the default sat. We've improved that, like I say, to bring in some of those industry guidelines, which basically reference your pasture growth rate. So when your pasture growth rate is higher, generally speaking, you'll get a better response in terms of your kilos of dry matter per kilo of nitrogen applied. And generally, if the pasture growth rate's higher, that response that you get will be in a shorter time frame as well. And when pasture growth is generally lower, you'll get a lower response to nitrogen, and the response will be over a longer kind of period of time as well. So we've essentially incorporated those rules into FARMAX. So if you look at the moment, I've got this application in kind of late winter, early spring, and I've got a response of 10 and a duration of 51. And it might be a little difficult to see on the screen here, but those numbers are sort of in gray, which essentially tells me that it's using FARMAX's defaults. Now I can always override this to say 12 and 40, 45, or whatever numbers I want to put in. And then those figures will turn black. If I delete those out, it'll just go back to those gray numbers, which are the FARMAX defaults. So at the moment, that's 10 and 51. If I were to pull that to later in the season, just as an example, it's still 10 and 51. Let's actually pull that a little earlier in the year. There we go. So we've pulled that over now to a time where there's lower pasture growth rates right in the middle of winter. And it's dropped that response to now only 8-to-1, and it's spread it over a 64-day period of time. So it will move around just depending on basically what your pasture growth rate is. So if you're on a farm that has a very extreme high and low in terms of pasture growth rate, you might see some more dramatic movements in that response and duration than you've seen just here. But yeah, hopefully that gives you a good idea of how that will change. So I'll move that back to sort of early September, and we're now back to that 10-to-1 response over 51 days. So that should have a pretty significant improvement, hopefully, in terms of how FARMAX models the nitrogen response, and should roll through to better feed forecasts. So any questions on that, or any questions on anything I've covered so far, drop them in the chat, and I'll answer those questions as they come through. So that is the nitrogen improvements and fertilizer database. We do have a question on that, which is how often is fertilizer price updated for the forecasting? A good question. At this stage, we added a couple of initial prices in with this 8.2 update, and we haven't done any price updates since then, although we have added a very short list of fertilizers. So if you do want to go in and add in your own fertilizers, you can do that. That's something that we'll have to make a call on, is the honest answer on that one, around how often we'll update that. With some of our other databases, like our store and works price schedules, for example, those are updated every month. For our expense, sort of farm working expenses, those are updated annually. So we'll have to make a call on exactly how often we update those fertilizer prices. But as it stands right now, there is a fair bit of flexibility there. So with this urea, for example, which I've got at $9.84 per ton, if the price does change and I want to add in a price that I know I'm going to pay for that fertilizer, either you can override that number, that will change the price for the full season. But what might be more useful, particularly if the price is swinging around all over the place, is you can actually click this pop out by dollars per ton, and that will give you, hopefully you can see that down the bottom of the screen there, that will give you this pop out where you can actually change those prices on a monthly basis if you want to. Again, that should give you more accurate forecasting, but yeah, good question there. Okay, so let's keep moving along and keep those questions coming in if you have them. So next I'm going to move into the one of the newer reports we've added, which is a report called carbon pricing. Now, actually, just before I look too much more closely at that, I may actually add in a forestry block just to give you a feel for how that works. So if you haven't added a forestry block before, they're reasonably straightforward to add in. Basically, just right click on your top level here, add a new block of forestry. That has added just 20 hectares initially, but you can update the areas if you need to. For this example, I'll leave it at 20 hectares. I can then go through to crops and describe what's on that forestry block. So let's stick with Pinus radiata, and let's say that I'm putting in an area of pines that's already established. So let's say that went in 2010. And importantly, for the report that I'm about to walk through, I'm going to tick that this is the first rotation of forestry on that block, which is going to be quite important for the carbon kind of financial calculations that we'll walk through here in a sec. Okay, so coming back up to carbon pricing, obviously this is a massive topic at the moment. I will do my best to answer any questions that come through on this. But essentially, this is kind of a starting point that we've recently added to FARMAX just to try and get the conversation going about understanding the financial implications of carbon credits and potential carbon tax if that comes on a farm business. So this is effectively bringing through those two areas of carbon that I spoke about earlier. Firstly, we've got the emissions from your stock and from your fertilizer. That's this gross emissions number of 1174 tons in the case of this farm. And then we've got the carbon sequestration element as well, which in the case of this farm is that 680 ton. And then essentially what we've given FARMAX users the ability to do here is to start kind of running through some scenarios on different cost-free allocations and different carbon prices. And we can get a bit of a sensitivity table. So with the current inputs, I've got some carbon credits coming through, which I think the current price is closer to this $80 number. So that comes out at about $54,000 for this particular farm. We've then got cost-free allocations, again, against that carbon price. If I were to look at, say, the 95% cost-free allocation and an $80 carbon price, that is a potential carbon liability for the farm of about $4,700, and 5,400 less that 4,700 gets me to 49,700, and that's coming through as a negative number. Being a good thing, basically saying that our carbon credits outweigh the potential carbon liability for the farm. So there is some flexibility here to update some of these assumptions. So if I go to options, I can go set carbon prices, and I can kind of update the the carbon price numbers that I want to work off here. Hit OK. And that flows through to updating this little calculator as well. So this doesn't flow through to any of your financial reports in FARMAX, doesn't hit your profit and loss or cash flow or anything like that. It's really just a calculator tool kind of sitting in there for people that are interested in better understanding some of the numbers behind this for a given farm. And if you're using FARMAX to run a scenario or anything like that, obviously these numbers will change if you're increasing or decreasing stock numbers or forestry areas or anything like that. Cool. So I will just have a check if we've got any more questions come through. Okay, we've got one more just on fertilizers initially. All my fertilizer data already exists in other systems. To what extent is FARMAX already integrating or planning to integrate with Balance, Ravensdown, who have their own data, or Precision Farming that has both? Very good question. The bit that FARMAX is precious about is probably the kind of what we refer to as the FARMAX engine and the calculations that FARMAX is running behind the scenes. We don't particularly care where that data comes from, and if we can integrate with partners to bring that sort of data in, the better that is for farmers, and the better that kind of is for everyone involved in our view. We don't have any of those integrations currently, but certainly something would like to do. Question from Jock: is the carbon price based on market carbon price in the ETS? Are there plans to include Tahoe whenua pricing for split gases? Yeah, good question. At the moment, everything is just kind of calculated in CO2 equivalents, and we've added in a kind of starting set of carbon prices in this sensitivity table, just kind of as a start point, and you can adjust those as you see fit. I think FARMAX has a pretty good history of just kind of adapting the tool and the environmental reports to essentially whatever the legislation is and whatever farmers require. So certainly if there's changes required, for this calculator to be more meaningful for farmers, that's something we'll do. And another one from Nicole: will you break the calculator down to show the impact of methane / long-lived gases on the total cost? That's a good question. I think that is probably similar to Jock's question around splitting out the gases. So certainly if that's the way that the legislation and so on goes, we'll kind of follow that. And one more question here from Laura, and then we'll just get into some of the other things we're keen to cover, but keep the questions coming. Laura asks: will fertilizers with a urease inhibitor factor in terms of greenhouse gases? Will FARMAX consider urease inhibitor factor in terms of greenhouse gas in-loss and other environmental factors? Yeah, good question. I guess again, basically if that's the kind of accepted methodology that farmers need to be calculating greenhouse gas emissions with, assuming that we've got the science available, we'll kind of follow that. One of the updates we should have coming is around urease coated urea, for example. We're working with some science partners to get information on that at the moment. So yeah, good question. Okay, keep the questions coming. I will keep moving through some of the new features here and then maybe loop around to answering some of the remaining questions if there's more that come through towards the end of the session, just to kind of keep things moving. Couple of updates to some other reports that we've got. So for a long time, we've had a lot of different stock reports around sales, purchases, deaths, and so on. We've made quite a few improvements, really just to add a lot of flexibility for people being able to slice and dice their data however they want to extract it in the transactions report recently. So if I go to the transactions report, this has quite a few updates in terms of the way that this report works, and like I say, the amount of flexibility it offers. So we've kind of consolidated a couple of different types of transactions into these various tabs up the top here. So I can click through sales, purchases, deaths, transfers out, transfers in, whatever you want to look at really. So if I go back to sales, we'll have a look through that one. And then I can filter my sales data on whatever type of information that I want to see. So I can choose to include or exclude store and works prices. Excuse me. So if I want to only look at my store sales, I can turn off works. If I only want to look at my work sales, I can click that one and turn off store, for example. So it allows me to filter the report depending on whatever I want to see there. So I'll turn everything on just for now for this example. I can also filter by a few different kind of ways of viewing it. So I can go by stock class as kind of the header column here. I can just list everything and that will give me mobs, or I can even do it by month. So if I want to get kind of summaries for each particular month, I can do that. I'll just flick back to stock class. Or if you've got a farm that has a lot of sales, like a lot of lambs sold to the works through key times of the year or something like that, I can also just run a report on a particular month. So if I go to December, for example, I've just got the one sale, but if you had a lot of lamb sales or something in December and January, and you want to run a report just on those sales, the transactions report should give you a lot of flexibility to do that. Okay, cool. I'm just going to run through one more report and then look at a brief kind of change we've made to scenarios as well, and then we'll loop back around to any remaining questions. So keep those coming through. So a couple of years ago, we added a report called RMPP KPIs, Red Meat Profit Partnership. So the Red Meat Profit Partnership a couple of years ago came up with basically, I believe at the time, 8 key KPIs that they viewed as sort of a really good starting point for comparing the performance of one farm against another. And we basically turned that into a report. It's been definitely one of the most popular reports in FARMAX since we've added it. And this is what that report looks like at the moment with some of those key KPIs. And you can actually kind of dive a little deeper here into how each of these metrics is calculated. So if I wanted to go to my farm working expenditure ratio, for example, I can click on that, and that gives me basically the maths behind how that's calculated. It gives me some links to go to other reports or other areas of FARMAX, or to the Beef and Lamb Knowledge Hub as well. So this is a report that's been around, like I say, for a couple of years. It's been pretty popular with FARMAX users, but we've recently added, I guess, aligned with trying to understand all these different aspects of the farm system. We've recently added some environmental KPIs in here as well. So if I scroll down, I've now got a new environment section. I get my greenhouse gas emissions per hectare. I also get some different efficiency metrics. So if I want to understand how much carbon the farm is emitting for every kilogram of product, I can get that, and same idea for gross margin as well. And just like the previous tiles, I can click on it, kind of see how the figure's calculated, and then go to any other reports that might be relevant as well. Okay, cool. So one last report update I will show you, which is a relatively minor change for us, really, but I'm hoping that it should be quite useful for when people are running scenarios. So I'm just going to make a quick scenario here. If you're not familiar with how to do this, this is more or less the process. Is when you create a scenario, you tend to duplicate a FARMAX file that represents your current farm system. You can make a few adjustments around the edges and then sort of compare your scenario against your initial file. So if I duplicate my monitoring here, and let's just call this summer lambs, something along those lines, and I will open both of those files up. Cool. So I will just quickly make a couple of changes to that summer lamb scenario. So I'll add in a enterprise of sheep. Let's call them finishing. And I'm going to add a very, very basic kind of trade lamb enterprise, but this is really just to get some of the scenario reports working so I can kind of run you through how that works. So let's say that I can buy 1,000 lambs in December. Let's say that I can get them at 28 kilos. And let's sell maybe 400 a month and then the balance in the third month. So that's got a few sales in there. And let's say I can do 170 grams of live weight gain. Just a very generic example just to kind of show you how this works. But that's got a simple kind of summer lamb finishing enterprise setup. And one of the things that, again, have been pretty popular in FARMAX for a long time is your scenario kind of comparison reports. So if I look at the profit and loss, for example, for this farm, I've actually already got it in our new view, but traditionally it would have showed up like this. So you would have been able to go through, see the difference in some of the financials in this particular report. So we've got about a $28,000 increase in our sheep revenue. And we've upped our stocking rate, and some expenses in here are probably budgeted on a dollars per stock unit basis. So I've had a few minor changes in cost, and we're up about $24,000 or so as a result. So that's been really useful for a long time. But one of the things we've added in FARMAX 8.2 is the option to go into this little drop-down menu and flick over to change, which basically gives you the difference in percentage terms, which can be particularly useful for things like greenhouse gases. If you're targeting a particular percentage reduction, for example, you can go through to the greenhouse gas report and look at percentage change. So if I'm looking in percentage terms, we're now up about 8.7% in farm profit before tax. And if I go to greenhouse gases, have a look at the table, and flick over to percentage terms, we are now up about 5.5%. So we've increased our greenhouse gas emissions from those higher stocking rates, and you'll see that it's particularly, it's bumped up a lot more in those summer months when the lambs are on. So like I say, reasonably straightforward change in FARMAX, but hopefully a pretty valuable one nonetheless. So that is basically all of the new features I wanted to run through this morning. So I'm just going to save and close out there and have a look at any last questions. If you do have any remaining questions, definitely pop them in the chat or the Q&A. And I'll just stop sharing for now. Okay. Let's see. We've got a question from Alison around doing a quick demo of the greenhouse gas report to show the different gases. I might just come back to that in a sec, Alison. Question from Greg, can it calculate on farm or graze area rather than total area? Yeah, good question. Actually, I'll just reshare my screen. Okay, cool. So let's have a look. Yeah, sorry, Greg, I'm not sure which report exactly I was on when you asked that question. It could have been the RMPP KPIs report, I'm guessing. And the RMPP KPIs report, everything here is just on a per farm hectare basis, as FARMAX calls it, which is probably more commonly referred to as your effective area. I believe that's just the way it was kind of set up for it. It was viewed as fairer for kind of farm-to-farm comparisons to use the effective area as opposed to the total area, because there's obviously big variation in the amount of forestry and sort of other areas farms can have. But most of the reporting in FARMAX does have the flexibility to be filtered a few different ways. So greenhouse gas is a good example of that, where we've got per total hectare, per farm hectare, which I just described, or per grazing hectare, which basically backs out any area that's out for crop or anything like that through the season. It's just purely looking at kind of pasture grazing area. So if I filter to go per farm hectare, my emissions in this case gone up a little because it's, you know, those same greenhouse gas emissions on a slightly smaller area now that I've no longer included the forestry component in that report. And just while I'm here, I will have a look at Alison's question because I had a couple of questions on split gases. So this is a greenhouse gas report we've had for a little while. If I go to some of these different tabs, you can actually get the breakdowns of those different gases. So this is split in this case between methane, nitrous oxide, and carbon dioxide from the urea applications. Can also break it down by source. So I can see how much is coming from the sheep versus the beef. I can filter it by CO2 equivalents or just the kilograms of kind of the raw, you know, gas amounts before it's been converted across to CO2 equivalents. So there's a lot of flexibility in there, and yeah, if we need to report those things or calculate carbon prices in a different way in future, we should have all the data there to do it. So good question. Got lots more coming through. So got next one is from Craig. Are KPIs in or coming to dairy? No. So I think pretty much everything I've shown today, bar the Red Meat Profit Partnership report, will be in dairy. So the Red Meat Profit Partnership report is kind of is red meat version specific. But yeah, open feedback there, Craig, on what you might like to see. I know you've been fairly heavily involved in quite a bit of benchmarking, so let us know there. Another question from Laura: will FARMAX consider any benchmarking around the environmental figures for farms with within regions / types of farms registered with FARMAX, e.g. like overseer? We have a few different benchmarking initiatives going on at the moment. The main one of note would be DSM, or Dairy Systems Monitoring, which is generally run by a consultant who sort of acts as a facilitator to benchmark groups of dairy farms. And we have a few different consultancies around the country offering that type of benchmarking. And the, you know, environmental KPIs are an increasingly important element of those benchmarking programs, but we haven't done any type of regional reporting with greenhouse gases yet. Yeah, like a lot of these things, we certainly wouldn't rule it out if people are interested in that. Always open to feedback. Another question: for the percentage change, can you compare more than 2 scenarios? Yeah, good question. So traditionally, and I'll just kind of show how this works. If I open up my summer lambs scenario, I have got the difference and percentage change column here. When I've got 2 files open, I will lose that when I add a third file. That's kind of always been the case. So I'll just add a new kind of blank file just to show you how that might look. My blank file will look fairly ugly here. Because there's not much data in there. But yeah, basically it would just show up as a third column like that. So you would lose that difference sort of column when you've got more than 2 files open. Okay, a couple more questions to get to. Greg was talking about the RMPP KPIs. That's cool. Question from Femi: is there a link to the update, please? Yep, good question. So if you've got FARMAX installed on your computer, when you open FARMAX, you should get a notification letting you know that there's a new version available, and that will there'll be a prompt or an option to download it from there. If you haven't got that yet, Femi, I might actually shoot you an email just so you can see that anyway. And I may actually also include it just in the follow-up email with this replay. Might be the simplest way to do that. But if you've already got FARMAX installed, it should just prompt you to download it. So, question from Tim: can expenses be imported from figured, both budget and actual plus year to date? Not at this stage, although our friends at FARMIQ have recently launched a figured integration, which is cool to see, but nothing on the FARMAX side at this stage. And a question from Roger: is there a CSV export for RMPP KPIs? Yep, sure. So I will go to, I actually don't recall, but we'll find out in a sec. Most of the reports in FARMAX have a export CSV option, which we actually don't in the RMPP KPIs. Okay, I'll follow up on that, Roger. Most of the reports we do, for example, if I go to supply demand, we've got a table in there and you can export that to CSV. I wonder if it's because it's tiles. We haven't added that option, but I will, I'll dig into that and I'll follow up with you if that's okay, Roger. Okay, it looks like that is all of the questions at this stage. So I appreciate you all coming along and asking lots of questions. That was really good. And like I say, if you do want to upgrade to this new version of FARMAX, you should be prompted to as soon as you open FARMAX up if you haven't downloaded it already. And we will circulate the replay in the next couple of days. So yeah, thanks everyone for attending. If you do have any questions, please don't hesitate to contact the help desk, and would be more than happy to help you out and answer them. But that's it for us today. So I hope everyone has a great rest of your day. Cheers.